December 17, 1944, near the village of Bleialf deep in the Ardennes Forest. A gray dawn struggled through the pine canopy as mist clung low to the churned-up snow. The air tasted of cordite and frozen sap, and every breath came out in a pale plume. Off in the distance, artillery thudded like a giant's heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, uncomfortably close. Lieutenant Karl Weber crouched behind a splintered tree trunk, rubbing his numb hands together as he peered across the clearing. His men from the 293rd Volksgrenadier Division stood huddled in silence, stooped under the weight of exhaustion. Their greatcoats were stiff with frost, their boots soaked through, their stomachs long since empty. Not one had eaten a proper hot meal in days, some in weeks. A thin, bitter odor drifted from a cold ration tin at Weber's feet, the remnants of ersatz coffee, little more than warm brown water. He kicked the can aside and tried not to think about food at all. The men had grown accustomed to the hollow ache, the gnawing that never went away. But then something strange drifted through the trees. Not the metallic tang of gun oil. Not the damp scent of snow. Not the smoke of another burning farmhouse. This was different, warm, rich, almost sweet. Obergefreiter Dieter Grunwald sniffed the air, lifting his head like a starving hound. "Sir, do you smell that?" Weber smelled it too, and his eyes narrowed. It smelled like stew, real stew, meat, vegetables, fat sizzling in a pan. A deception impossible. Americans didn't waste time cooking at the front, or so the Germans believed. But the scent was growing stronger, thick, irresistible, drifting on the faint breeze. And then they heard it, the soft mechanical clatter of engines, several of them rolling along a narrow forest road just beyond the ridge. The men tensed, weapons rising. American vehicles. But as the first olive-drab silhouette appeared through the fog, Weber blinked in disbelief. It wasn't a tank. It wasn't an armored car. It wasn't even a supply truck. It was a kitchen. A full, steel-bodied American M1937 mobile field range, its stovepipes puffing white clouds of steam into the cold morning air. Behind it came another, and another, a convoy of rolling kitchens, each one rattling forward like some bizarre parade. Weber mouthed a single word under his breath. "Unfassbar. Unbelievable." The American cooks, actual uniformed cooks, walked alongside their machines wearing aprons dusted with flour and grease. One carried a ladle the size of a shovel. Another banged a metal serving spoon against a pot the way a drummer might beat a marching cadence. His men stared, stunned into silence. It was the middle of a battle, guns firing, engines roaring, the sky echoing with distant anti-aircraft bursts, and the Americans were bringing hot food directly to the front line. Bowls of beef stew, fresh biscuits, coffee so strong the smell alone felt like it could wake the dead. To Weber's frozen, starving troops, it looked like a hallucination. But it was real. A nearby American infantry platoon cheered as the kitchens rolled up. Soldiers slung M1 Garands on their shoulders, laughing as they crowded around the steaming pots. One trooper clapped a cook on the back. "You're a damn hero, Charlie. I thought we were gonna freeze out here." Another trooper lifted a biscuit the way a priest might raise the Eucharist. "Hot food in the middle of the Ardennes, boys, we ain't losing this war." Weber's men watched from the tree line, hungry, shivering, silent. Every one of them knew the truth. The German army could never do this. Their kitchens, when they had them at all, were miles behind the line. Fuel was scarce, fresh ingredients scarcer still. Most days the men survived on cold bread, canned meat, or nothing at all. But the Americans, they were eating like it was a Sunday on the family farm. Gefreiter Johannes Futsch whispered, stunned. "They eat hot meals during an offensive." Weber couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The cooks were already serving second helpings, coffee mugs clinked, steam rose in thick, comforting clouds, and still the kitchens kept rolling forward, delivering food as effortlessly as ammunition or fuel. It wasn't just luxury. It was logistics turned into a weapon. And Weber realized with a slow sinking feeling that this simple, ordinary scene revealed something far more terrifying than any tank or bomber. The Americans weren't just fighting with soldiers. They were fighting with a supply system so vast and so efficient that even in the frozen wilderness of the Ardennes, in the midst of a desperate German counteroffensive, they could feed their troops like kings. To the starving Germans in the tree line, it felt like watching the future defeat them in real time. Weber exhaled, tremor in his breath. "This," he said quietly, "is why they will win." The distant clatter of machine gun fire snapped Lieutenant Weber back to reality. The American field kitchens were still ladling out stew, but now rifle reports echoed along the ridge. The Bulge offensive was unfolding in chaos, and the 293rd Volksgrenadiers had orders to probe forward fast. Weber signaled his men to move. They slipped through the trees, crunching softly over icy underbrush. The smell of food still hung in the air, tormenting them with every step. But as they crested a shallow rise overlooking the American position, Weber froze again. The U.S. infantry platoon had pulled back toward their defensive line, no doubt to respond to the fighting elsewhere. But the field kitchens, they remained. 3 entire M1937 mobile ranges unprotected, their steel bellies still hissing with heat. The cooks, shouting to one another as they packed up utensils, hadn't yet noticed the Germans creeping down the slope. Obergefreiter Grunwald swallowed hard. "Sir, we could take them." Weber hated the idea. His mission was reconnaissance, not scavenging, but the hollow eyes of his men left little room for hesitation. Hunger had stripped away the last layers of hesitation and ceremony. "Forward," Weber ordered, quietly. They moved like ghosts, rifles leveled, boots muffled by snow. The American cooks turned at the last moment, but too late. Within seconds, the Germans had surrounded the kitchens. One cook raised his flour-covered hands. All right, don't shoot, we're just feeding people." Weber stepped forward, lowering his MP-40 slightly but keeping its barrel trained on the group. "You are prisoners," he said in clipped English. "Hands high, move away from the vehicles." The cooks obeyed, grumbling under their breath. One muttered, "Hell of a way to ruin breakfast." But Weber's men were no longer focused on the prisoners. They were staring at the food. At the mountains of it. Inside the compartments of the first kitchen was a pot big enough to bathe a child in, filled with thick stew, beans, beef chunks, carrots, potatoes, all simmering in a rich broth. Another container brimmed with scrambled eggs, a third held biscuits stacked like golden bricks. Coffee percolated in tall metal urns, its aroma so overwhelming that Futch nearly cried. Weber knew discipline was slipping. And honestly, he didn't have the heart to enforce it. "Eat," he said quietly, quickly. The men surged forward, dipping ladles into steaming pots, filling mess tins, eating with desperate, trembling hands. Some were too cold to chew immediately. They held bites of food in their mouths just to let the warmth seep in. For several, tears streamed unashamedly down their cheeks. The American cooks watched, stunned. One said softly, "Jesus, they're starving." Another, shaking his head, whispered to a fellow prisoner, "Look at them. We eat better in a foxhole than they do in barracks." It was true. And everyone present knew it. As Weber took his first sip of American coffee, strong, dark, almost shockingly good, he felt heat spread through his entire body. It wasn't just warmth. It was a strange, painful reminder of normal life of the world before the war. But the moment couldn't last. A distant engine growled through the trees, then another. The cooks exchanged wide-eyed glances. "Sir," Grunwald said urgently, "American reinforcements." Weber cursed under his breath. The Germans weren't equipped for a firefight, not with half the men clutching mess tins instead of rifles. He ordered the kitchens rigged for towing, anything to recover some of the precious equipment and food. But as the Americans closed in, it quickly became clear they had only minutes. "Leave them," Weber barked, "fall back now." The Germans dropped ladles and mugs, grabbing weapons, retreating up the wooded slope. A few men stole biscuits or filled pockets with scraps in a final act of desperation, but none dared linger. Machine gun fire cracked from the advancing American scouts. Snow spurted into the air around the Germans as they scrambled uphill. Weber stayed at the rear, firing bursts to slow the pursuit. By the time the Germans reached the safety of the woods, panting and battered, the Americans had reclaimed their kitchens. The cooks cheered at the sight of U.S. troops. One shouted, "They stole our breakfast." Another hollered back, "We'll cook more, they can't eat us out of supplies." Weber heard those words carried on the wind. And they cut deeper than any bullet. His men collapsed behind fallen logs, clutching their stomachs, no longer with hunger but with the shock of what they'd seen and tasted. Grunwald sat down heavily. "Sir, they can afford to lose food like this. We fight over crumbs." Weber didn't respond, he didn't have to. Because in that moment, every German soldier understood the same truth. The Americans weren't winning because of numbers. Or tanks. Or aircraft. They were winning because they could feed an army as easily as they could arm it. What the Germans had witnessed that morning wasn't just a meal. It was a revelation, one that would haunt them long after the taste of American food faded from their tongues. Snowfall thickened as the Germans caught their breath beneath the pines, flakes settling on helmets and scarves as silently as ash. The forest around them felt oppressively still, no engines, no orders, no artillery, only the heavy, muffled quiet that followed a narrow escape. Lieutenant Weber leaned against a tree, his pulse still racing. His breath had formed a thin layer of frost across his scarf, but even now, even amidst the danger, he could still taste the stew on his tongue. The warmth in his chest had not yet faded. The others sat slumped around him like winter-worn statues. Some stared blankly at the ground, processing what they had just experienced. Others clutched small remnants of food, a piece of biscuit saved in a pocket, a scrap of meat held like sacred treasure. Jeffreiter Futz held out his shaking hand. "Sir, look, real coffee." A half-filled tin cup steamed weakly between his fingers. Weber nodded, but his thoughts were drifting. He glanced through the trees toward the American lines where the distant rattle of returning field kitchens echoed faintly. The sound was almost cheerful. It felt like humiliation. Oberjefreiter Grunwald broke the silence. "We've been fighting ghosts," he said quietly. Weber frowned. "Explain." Grunwald gestured vaguely toward the American position. "They fight differently, they fight with comfort, they fight with supplies, they fight with—" He struggled to find the word, finally settling on abundance. Another soldier spoke up, bitterness cracking in his voice. "Abundance we never had, even at the beginning of the war." And that was the truth no German wanted to say aloud. Their army, disciplined, proud, fearsome in attack, had never been sustained by anything close to American logistics. Weber shifted, the cold seeping into his bones again now that the fleeting warmth of the meal had passed. He forced himself to think clearly. "Command believes we can break their lines," he said, "cut them off, divide their forces." But the men only looked back at him with hollow eyes. They had just seen the reality for themselves. Breaking American lines wouldn't matter if the enemy could simply feed their soldiers endlessly, rebuild faster, reinforce stronger, and fight with energy the Germans no longer possessed. A low rumble carried through the forest. "Not artillery. Engines." The men tensed, weapons raised, but this time it wasn't Americans. It was German armor, a few battered Panzer IVs crawling through the snow, trailed by a thin line of grenadiers. Their engines sputtered, coughing black smoke into the cold air. One tank's track squealed with every rotation, metal grinding against metal. As the column halted briefly, Weber approached the nearest tank commander, a veteran Feldwebel named Kruger whose face was as weathered as worn leather. "We had contact with American support units," Weber reported. "They were moving kitchens to the front." Kruger snorted. "Kitchens, they bring restaurants to a battlefield now." "They bring hot meals," Weber answered sharply. for entire companies in the middle of the fighting. The tank commander's smirk faded, his eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his black panzer cap. "No wonder their infantry fights so damn hard," he muttered. "A warm belly makes a stubborn soldier." He wasn't joking. He wasn't exaggerating. He was stating a military fact that had been understood for centuries. A cold, hungry army fights on willpower alone. A fed, warm army fights with strength. Kruger glanced toward the distant American lines and shook his head. "We are running on fumes, and they are running on fuel, food, and factories." Weber knew it too. But hearing it from Kruger made it sting even more. As the tanks prepared to move again, Kruger leaned down from his turret. "Lieutenant, you saw what we're up against. This offensive, do you think it can succeed?" Weber hesitated. He thought of the steaming pots, the endless trays of biscuits, the cheerful American cooks, the effortless abundance rolling to the front line as casually as mail delivery. Then he looked at his own men, freezing, starving, exhausted. And he knew the answer. But he couldn't say it. Not aloud. Kruger didn't need to hear it. He simply nodded grimly and closed the hatch. The panzers growled forward, heading deeper into the Ardennes. Weber and his grenadiers followed on foot, their shadows stretching across the snow as the sun fought to break through the gray sky. Yet no matter how far they marched, no matter how many miles they trudged through ice and mud, the same realization walked with them, heavy as the packs on their shoulders. The Americans had mastered something Germany never had. The power to sustain war endlessly and effortlessly through logistics that seemed almost supernatural in scale. And for Weber's men, the sight of those field kitchens had done more damage to morale than any enemy bombardment. It was the first crack in their belief that victory was still possible. A crack that would only widen in the days to come. Hours later, the forest had grown darker. Thick clouds rolled overhead, turning the late afternoon into an early dusk. Snowflakes swirled in ragged gusts, carried between the towering spruces like ash blown through a cathedral of frozen giants. The 293rd Volksgrenadiers trudged behind the panzers, boots sinking into knee-deep drifts. Their breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. The stolen warmth from the American stew had long vanished, replaced once again by the familiar, all-consuming chill. Lieutenant Weber pulled his scarf tighter as he scanned the path ahead. They were approaching a crossroads, one of the many small, nameless junctions that crisscrossed the Ardennes. The Germans needed it open, the Americans needed it held. The fate of entire battalions was being decided on these tiny, frozen paths. But as Weber drew closer, he spotted something in the snow that made his stomach twist. Tire tracks. Wide ones, fresh ones. American supply vehicles had passed through only hours earlier. Kruger's panzer rumbled to a halt, the engine growling like a caged beast. The commander popped his hatch. "You see it too." Weber nodded. The tracks led west to a ridge the Germans had been trying to reach since dawn. But mixed among the prints were small, round impressions, almost like metal pads. Grunwald crouched, touching one with gloved fingers. "Sir, these are from the American kitchen units." They were. The field kitchens had been here too, feeding the U.S. infantry holding the ridge. Weber felt the weight of the discovery settle on him like a stone. The Americans didn't just have hot food. They moved it everywhere. With precision. With confidence. In numbers Germany could barely imagine. He pictured the scene. American infantry forming long lines while cooks served steaming ladles of stew right behind the frontline foxholes. Soldiers warming hands around metal cups. Quick calories, quick comfort, quick strength. A battlefield was supposed to be hunger, exhaustion, deprivation. The Americans had turned it into a place of support. Kruger climbed fully out of his turret, staring at the tracks. "In Russia," he said quietly, "men froze to death waiting for soup. Here, the Americans bring soup to them." There was no sarcasm. Only awe and a bitterness that tasted like iron. The rumble of distant artillery echoed through the forest. American guns, well-fed, well-supplied gunners firing with unbroken rhythm. Each shell a reminder that their logistical tail stretched back, unbroken, all the way to Cherbourg to Antwerp and across the Atlantic to factories that never slept. Weber's radio crackled. A young operator pressed the handset to his ear. "Sir, command wants us to advance on the ridge immediately. Reinforcements are delayed. Fuel shortage." Fuel shortage. Another phrase Weber had grown numb to. But hearing it now, after seeing the American abundance, felt like a punch to the ribs. While the Americans poured hot meals into their fighting men, Germany poured promises into empty tanks. Weber lowered the radio slowly. "Tell them we're moving," he said, his voice low but steady. The men tightened their gear, adjusted helmets, and fixed bayonets as the column prepared to advance. But their steps were slower than before, their breaths heavier, not just from fatigue. From the realization that they were no longer fighting a comparable enemy. They were fighting an empire of supply. A few minutes into their march, the wind shifted. From the west came a faint, unmistakable scent. Coffee. Fresh and strong. Even now, even here, the Americans were brewing coffee within smelling distance of German lines. Futz clenched his jaw. "They drink like they're in a cafe." Weber corrected him quietly. "They drink like they know they won't run out." Ahead the ridge loomed. American machine gun nests flashed sporadically, their tracers slicing through the dimming afternoon. Weber signaled his men into cover, spreading out behind logs and snowbanks. The firefight began almost at once, rifles cracking, MG-42s rattling with their signature roar. Snow danced up in white fountains as bullets tore into the ground. But the Americans fought with vigor, energy, confidence. And Weber knew why. You could see it in the way they moved. Steady, measured. Not starving. Not freezing. Not drained by days of cold rations and sleepless nights. They were fueled by a supply machine that reached them reliably, relentlessly, even under fire. As Weber fired bursts toward an American foxhole, he glimpsed a medic running between positions carrying metal containers, still steaming. Hot meals delivered in the middle of a firefight. Unthinkable in the German army. Grunwald ducked behind a fallen tree as bullets whined overhead. "Sir," he shouted, "how do we fight against an army that never gets tired?" Weber didn't answer. Because he didn't know. And for the first time, as the ridge battle raged and snow churned beneath their boots, the Germans understood that the true enemy wasn't the men shooting back at them. It was the American supply chain. The invisible giant standing behind every soldier, every machine gun, every tank, feeding the fight with endless strength. Night fell without ceremony, no sunset, no color, just a dimming of the world until the forest became a maze of shifting shadows and muffled shapes. The battle on the ridge slowed, then sputtered into an uneasy quiet as both sides pulled back to regroup. Snow blanketed everything, the trenches, the trees, the bodies. Lieutenant Weber's men huddled in a shallow depression behind the ridge, their breath forming faint halos in the moonlight. The cold gnawed at them with silent teeth. Wet wool stiffened into icy armor, fingers curled stiff around rifle grips. But what gnawed harder was the memory of the American kitchens. The warmth. The abundance. The easy confidence of soldiers who fought knowing their next meal was guaranteed. Futch crouched beside Weber, staring blankly into the darkness. "Sir," he whispered, "I don't think I can feel my toes." Weber didn't doubt him. He couldn't feel his either. The men were freezing from the inside out. Behind them, Kruger's panzers sat idle beneath the trees, cold, immobile beasts of steel. Their engines were off to save precious fuel. One crew was outside, hammering at the frozen track links with the butt of a wrench, cursing through clenched teeth as the metal refused to budge. Weber knew the sound well. It was the sound of a machine that had been pushed past its limits, just like the men. A soft rustle drew his attention. Grunwald approached, his helmet dusted with snow. Sir, he said somberly, we gathered rations. He held up a cloth bag. Inside were a few stale crackers, a handful of dried beans, and a sliver of black bread hard enough to chip a tooth. We split it 17 ways, Grunwald added. We saved some for you. Weber shook his head. Give mine to the younger ones. Grunwald hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't much. But hunger had made not much feel like treasure. The men gnawed at the scraps slowly, almost reverently. But even as they ate, their eyes drifted westward toward the American lines, toward the memory of warmth that seemed more like a dream now than something they'd actually touched. Futch broke the silence again. Sir, when we were at Brest, at Cherkasy, at Narva, we fought against enemies, we fought against soldiers, but this. He gestured vaguely toward the American ridge. This feels different. Weber didn't interrupt. He wanted his men to speak, to release the weight pressing on them. It's like, Futch searched for the right words, like fighting an entire country at once. A murmur of agreement passed through the group. They all felt it. The sense that the Americans didn't just have better equipment or more men, they had an entire industrial machine carrying them forward, lifting them up, feeding them, warming them, giving them strength the Germans could no longer match. Kruger approached from the tanks, steam rolling from his mouth as he exhaled sharply. Fuel's nearly gone, he said. We have enough to move maybe 2 kilometers before we're dry. Weber rubbed his temples. That's the last reserve. Kruger nodded grimly. Headquarters promised more fuel, but the roads are choked with snow and the convoys aren't making it through. The men exchanged glances. They knew the truth. The German army was suffocating under its own shortages. Weber closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion dragging at him like gravity. He remembered 1940, fast-moving columns, well-stocked depots, engines roaring down French roads with confidence and momentum. That Germany was gone. This Germany was starving, freezing, breaking apart one shortage at a time. And the Americans? They were eating stew on heated frontline kitchens while brewing coffee that could be smelled half a kilometer away. Grunwald sat beside Weber, voice low. Sir, if this is what they can do in winter in the middle of a counteroffensive, imagine what their supply lines look like in spring. Weber didn't want to imagine it. Because he knew imagining it meant accepting something unthinkable. That Germany could not win. Snow fell harder. The wind stiffened. The forest groaned. Weber stood slowly, looking at each of his men. Faces gaunt. Eyes sunken. Hands shaking from hunger and cold. And yet still loyal, still fighting, still hoping for orders that could make sense of the impossible. Listen, Weber said softly, steadying his voice. What you saw today, what you tasted, it wasn't weakness, it wasn't indulgence. He paused. It was power, the kind of power that wins wars before the bullets even fly. Silence enveloped them. The truth hung heavy in the frozen air. Behind the ridge, the Americans were preparing their next hot meal. Behind the Germans, nothing was coming. No fuel, no food, no relief, just the long, slow collapse of an army stretched to breaking. For Weber's men, the shock of that realization hit harder than any artillery barrage. Something fundamental inside them had cracked. Not loyalty. Not duty. But belief. And once belief broke, no soldier, no matter how brave, ever fought the same again. Morning didn't arrive so much as it slowly bled into existence, an anemic, colorless light that filtered through the trees like a dying lantern. The forest was silent except for the occasional groan of freezing wood and the soft hiss of falling snow. The men stirred slowly, stiffly, as though waking from a night spent buried in ice. Lieutenant Weber stood first. His joints felt brittle, his muscles heavy. He brushed the snow from his greatcoat and scanned the tree line. Even through the last shadows of dawn, he could see movement along the ridge, the Americans repositioning, fresh shapes, new silhouettes, more men, more equipment. They were reinforcing. And they had eaten breakfast. Grunwald slogged over, boots cracking through the crusted snow. His breath came out in ragged puffs. "Sir, scouts report increased vehicle traffic on their western flank. Trucks, half-tracks, some of those damn kitchen units again." Weber didn't answer immediately. He watched a group of American soldiers down the slope. They were forming up along a new line, checking rifles, adjusting helmets, moving with an ease that came only from warm bodies and full stomachs. A few of them clutched metal mugs, steam curling upward in delicate spirals that taunted the winter air. Futch appeared beside him, hugging his rifle for warmth. "Sir, they drink coffee at sunrise, hot coffee before a fight." Weber's reply came out flat. "They're preparing to push." As if cued by his words, a distant whistle blew from the American side, sharp, clean, confident. Seconds later, the thumping of boots echoed through the snow as a formation of U.S. infantry began to move downhill. Not rushing, not stumbling, advancing with practiced discipline. Kruger arrived at a half-run, his face tight with concern. "Lieutenant, we can't move the tanks, the fuel's too low. If we advance, we're stuck. If we retreat, we're stuck. They're immobile." Weber clenched his jaw. "So they're wrecks." "Paperweights," Kruger answered bitterly, "metal statues." He saw it now with painful clarity. The Americans had eaten. The Germans had shivered. The Americans were advancing. The Germans were frozen in place, literally and logistically. A single meal had turned into a tactical advantage. Machine gun fire blasted from the ridge, forcing Weber's men into the snow. American bar gunners were laying suppressing fire with terrifying accuracy. The cracks of M1 rifles followed, their cadence smooth and relentless. Behind the Americans, more steam rose, more kitchens, now set up in support positions. Weber watched as a cook handed a soldier a fresh biscuit before he sprinted forward to join the assault. A biscuit before combat. Weber felt something twist in his gut that had nothing to do with hunger. The snow erupted around them as American mortars began to bracket the German line. Kruger ducked behind a stump, shouting over the roar. "They hit like they slept 8 hours and ate like kings." Weber forced himself to think through the chaos. "We pull back into the deeper woods toward the secondary line." Grunwald hesitated. "Sir, if we retreat now, we'll lose the crossroads." "We've already lost it," Weber said quietly. "They're supplying themselves faster than we can even react." A mortar detonated nearby, showering them with snow and splinters. The air filled with the clang of shrapnel on tank hulls. American infantry surged forward, firing steadily, shouting orders with clarity and energy that felt almost surreal. Weber signaled the retreat. The men scrambled back through the drifts, stumbling over roots, slipping on ice. The forest swallowed them one by one as they fled deeper into the trees. But even as they retreated, the same sound followed them. The steady rumble of American trucks sending more supplies to the front. More food. More fuel. More everything. Logistics weren't behind the battle anymore. They were the battle. Hours later, when Weber finally regrouped with what remained of his platoon, he looked at their drained faces, sunken, shivering, exhausted beyond words. They had fought hard, but it hadn't mattered. Not against an enemy who could replenish strength faster than the Germans could lose it. Futch slumped against a tree, voice barely audible. "Sir, they fought like machines today." Weber shook his head. "No, they fought like men who aren't starving." Night crept in again, and with it the cold. The forest seemed to close around them, a cage of ice and darkness. But the truth was clearer than ever. The Americans weren't advancing on bravery alone. They were advancing on calories, fuel, warmth, and an industrial might so vast it made every German unit feel like a grain of snow against an avalanche. Grunwald sat beside Weber, pulling his coat tighter. "This war," he said softly, "isn't going to be won by bullets, not anymore." Weber stared into the trees where the Americans had disappeared. The distant glow of their campfires flickered like stars. And somewhere beyond those fires, the field kitchens steamed on. The same rolling giants of steel that had stunned his men fed the enemy and turned the tide without firing a single shot. In that moment, Weber finally understood the thing he had been resisting for days. The German army wasn't being pushed back by superior tactics or even superior numbers. It was being crushed by the weight of American logistics, a quiet, unstoppable force that no bravery could overcome. By the next morning, the forest felt like a frozen graveyard. The trees stood motionless beneath their heavy coats of snow, birds had vanished, even the wind moved cautiously, whispering in thin, nervous breaths. The war had grown quiet, too quiet. Lieutenant Weber crouched beside a fallen spruce, studying his map with numb fingers. A light tremor rippled through the paper as he held it, not fear, not cold. Both. His men stood clustered nearby, forming a ragged semicircle around a tiny fire that barely managed to stay alive. Black smoke coiled upward in thin, sickly ribbons. They had burned part of a broken ammunition crate to keep it alive. Every twig in the Ardennes seemed frozen solid. Grunwald approached, wiping frost from his eyebrows. "Sir," he said, voice low, "the scouts have returned." Two scouts stepped forward, young soldiers whose cheeks were hollow and pale. One saluted weakly. "We found a clearing 3 kilometers west," he reported. "Americans are building up there, trucks, jeeps, anti-tank guns, and kitchens too." Futch closed his eyes slowly, almost painfully, as if the word itself hurt. "Kitchens." Weber exhaled. "How many?" "Too many to count," the scout replied, "and fresh troops are arriving every hour." Kruger joined them, his face drawn but alert. "I heard their artillery warming up. They're preparing something big." Weber stared at the map. They were trapped between two converging American forces, one pushing from the ridge, another assembling in the west. The Germans had no fuel to reposition the panzers, no ammunition to sustain a long fight, no food to keep the men strong. They weren't just exhausted, they were eroding. Weber folded the map slowly. "They're going to close the gap," he said quietly. "Once they do, we're finished." A silence followed, thick as ice. Futch broke it with a hollow voice. "We can't outrun them anymore, can we?" Weber didn't answer. The truth required no words. The Americans had begun their push by mid-morning. The sound announced itself first, a distant chorus of engines, the unmistakable metallic howl of tracked vehicles carving through snow. Then came the muffled thump of artillery, setting the forest trembling. Weber's men took positions behind trees, logs, and hastily dug snow pits. They steadied rifles with shaking hands. They checked magazines that felt too light, grenades that felt too few. Then they saw the first shapes emerge through the fog. American infantry, well-rested, well-fed, moving with grim determination. Their rifles rose in unison. Their officers gestured forward with crisp confidence. Behind them, half-tracks growled and tanks rumbled like approaching thunder. But what struck the Germans hardest wasn't the tanks. It was the smell. Even now, that same impossible scent of hot food drifted behind the American lines. The rolling kitchens had parked far enough back to avoid fire but close enough to keep the troops supplied. Steam drifted above them like ghostly banners. Weber watched a group of American soldiers jog forward, wiping crumbs from their gloves. They had eaten minutes before launching an assault. A machine gun erupted from the German line, rattling through the trees. The Americans hit the ground, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Bullets sliced into bark. Snow exploded upward in white plumes. The Germans fought desperately, but desperation is a brittle thing. It shatters quickly. Within 15 minutes, their right flank had crumbled. Within 30, their machine gun jammed from the cold. Within 40, a panzer ground to a halt, its last fumes of fuel spent. American forces pressed in relentless. Weber shouted orders: fall back, cover the left, hold the line, but his voice felt drowned in the roar of rifles and mortars. His men were slipping, sliding, stumbling through snow that swallowed their legs. Grunwald fired until his rifle clicked empty, then ducked behind a stump, gasping. "They don't stop, sir, they just don't stop." Weber grabbed him by the coat. "They don't stop because they can keep going." A soldier beside them cried out as shrapnel tore through his sleeve, dropping into the snow with a thud. Another wheezed through frozen breath as he pried open his last ammunition pouch, empty. The American line surged closer. Their shots grew louder, clearer, steadier. Their officers shouted through the chaos. "Keep pushing. Second squad, move up. Keep your spacing, kitchens are 2 minutes behind us if you need resupply." 2 minutes behind them. With food. With fuel. With more strength. Weber's stomach twisted. The final, unbearable truth settled over him. The Germans weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a supply empire, a nation whose factories, ships, railroads, and kitchens moved like a single organism. The American advance was not just force. It was momentum, fed by logistics so vast that even the frozen Ardennes couldn't slow it. Weber signaled the retreat, what was left of one. His men stumbled backward through the trees, carrying wounded, dropping rifles, collapsing into snowdrifts. The forest swallowed them as the Americans surged forward, unstoppable as an incoming tide. And somewhere behind that tide, the kitchens rumbled calmly along, still steaming, still cooking, still fueling the machine that Germany could no longer outrun. The front hadn't broken because of a single battle. It broke because Weber and his men finally understood. You can fight hunger for a day, for a week, for a month. But you cannot win a war starving. The forest swallowed the remnants of Weber's platoon like a wounded animal limping into the shadows to escape the inevitable. Snow hammered down in thick, swirling sheets now, no longer drifting gently but falling with the heavy, relentless weight of winter closing its grip. Every footstep broke through the crust with a dull crunch. Every breath stung the lungs with sharp needles of cold. Weber led from the front, stumbling through the dense pines with his MP-40 slung across his chest. His boots were soaked to the ankle. His fingers felt like carved wood, foreign objects attached to his own arms. And behind him, his men trailed in a ragged line that stretched and contracted with every rise of the terrain. Grunwald struggled up a small incline, gasping. "Sir, how far do we pull back?" Weber didn't slow. "Until we find cover, until we can regroup." Futch, hobbling several paces behind, let out a bleak laugh that cracked at the edges. "Regroup with what? Empty rifles, frozen boots." No one corrected him. Not even Weber. The truth was visible all around them, in the shivering shoulders, the hollow eyes, the way every soldier leaned forward as if gravity itself were trying to drag them into the snow. They were no longer a fighting force. They were survivors. And the line between the two had vanished hours ago. A sharp boom echoed through the trees. Snow cascaded from high branches as a distant American mortar round detonated somewhere behind them. The sound vibrated through Weber's ribs like a drumbeat. "The Americans are still advancing," Kruger muttered, glancing back, "even in this storm." Weber didn't have to look, he could hear it. The rhythmic thumping of boots, the grind of engines, the steady advance of an army that refused to tire. Even now, faintly, he could smell something on the wind. Coffee. Hot and fresh. Somehow impossible. Futch sniffed the air and blinked through tears of exhaustion. "They're drinking again, they're drinking while hunting us." Weber clenched his teeth and forced himself to keep moving. He knew what the smell meant. Not taunting. Not mockery. Efficiency. Mobility. Assurance. The Americans were fed at dawn, fed before battle, fed after battle, fed on the march. Their strength regenerated with every kilometer they advanced. And while German soldiers marched with their stomachs grinding empty, American soldiers marched with their stomachs full and their spirits carried by warmth. The platoon reached a narrow ravine choked with fallen timber, perhaps the only shelter they had seen since their retreat began. Weber raised a hand. "We rest here," he said, 10 minutes. The men collapsed like marionettes with their strings cut. Some leaned back against the snow-packed embankment, staring up at the sky as if asking it for mercy. Others clutched their weapons close more from habit than readiness. One man, Schroeder, barely 19, shivered violently, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Grunwald knelt beside him, rubbing his arms. "Stay awake," he murmured. "Stay awake or you'll freeze." Weber crouched beside the group, forcing his own mind to stay sharp. He needed a plan. A route. Anything. But there was nowhere left to run. He heard a faint metallic clatter, vehicles moving, maybe a kilometer away, American half-tracks. They were tightening the noose. Kruger joined him, breath fogging the air. "Lieutenant, the panzers are gone, the radio is dead, half the men can barely stand." Weber nodded slowly. "I know." Kruger stared at him, eyes hollow. "What do we do now?" Weber didn't answer immediately. He looked at his men instead, the frost-bitten fingers, the sunken cheeks, the weary gazes that had once held iron resolve. Now they held something else. Recognition. The simple, painful understanding that bravery alone could not fill a stomach or thaw frozen limbs or stop an army fueled by a nation's endless abundance. Weber finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "We survive, that's all we can do." Another distant boom shook snow loose from nearby branches. The Americans were getting closer, advancing methodically, steadily, inevitably. Fudge looked up from the ground. "Sir, did you ever think it would end like this?" Weber considered the question. He remembered 1940 Belgium, France, the breakneck advance. He remembered fields of wheat swaying under summer skies, the confidence of a young officer marching at the tip of a victorious army. But now he stood in a frozen ravine, surrounded by starving men hunted by an enemy whose power didn't come solely from rifles or tanks, but from supply lines that never faltered, from kitchens that never went cold. "No," Weber said quietly, "not like this." A distant shout carried through the forest, American voices, clear, confident, getting closer. Weber rose slowly, his legs trembling. "On your feet," he said, "we move again." The men dragged themselves upright, swaying like reeds in a storm. Their retreat began anew, slow, painful, inevitable. Behind them, the American lines advanced with the same unstoppable momentum. Behind them, the kitchens followed, steaming, rolling, feeding, sustaining. The quiet engines of an empire at war. And Weber understood more clearly than ever that the battle had already been lost long before the first shot was fired. It was lost the moment the Americans learned how to feed an army better than anyone else on Earth. By late afternoon, the forest had shifted color again, darker, more oppressive. The sky sagged low as if exhausted from watching the suffering below. Snow drifted in lazy spirals, settling on the shoulders of Weber's men as they trudged through the deepening white. The cold had worked its way past uniforms and cloth, sinking into bone. Weber pushed forward, each step an act of will rather than strength. His breath steamed heavily through the scarf wrapped across his mouth. His feet were numb, his fingertips burned, then faded to a troubling dullness. Grunwald stumbled next to him, leaning on his rifle like a crutch. "Sir, I don't think I can go farther." Weber steadied him. "We'll stop soon, there has to be a farmhouse ahead." But he didn't believe it. No one did. The forest stretched endlessly. The war had turned the Ardennes into a frozen labyrinth with no mercy and no escape. Behind them, the Americans continued their slow but unstoppable advance. Weber could hear the distant echoes. Orders shouted with clarity. Engines rolling confidently. Occasional bursts of rifle fire, not frantic but measured. And impossibly, the wind carried that same scent again. Stew. Coffee. Warm bread. Even now. Even in pursuit. The men around Weber stiffened. Futch let out a faint, broken laugh. "They're feeding themselves while running us down." Kruger wiped frost from his eyelashes and stared westward through the trees. "That's not an army behind us," he muttered. "It's a machine." They pressed on for another kilometer before they saw the first sign that their march was ending. A clearing littered with spent ammunition crates, abandoned gear, and churned snow, evidence of a German unit that had passed through in chaos. A fallen signpost lay half-buried in the drift. The markings were smeared, but Weber could still read a single word. Ausgeschöpft. Exhausted, spent. It felt like the forest was mocking them. Kruger sank to his knees. "This is as far as we go," he said softly. "We don't have fuel, we don't have ammo, we don't have food. What are we even fighting with now?" Weber stared at him. It wasn't insubordination. It wasn't defeatism. It was truth. Grunwald collapsed beside a tree, head resting against the trunk. "I can't feel my legs," he whispered. "Sir, I think I'm done." Weber swallowed, his throat felt tight, raw from the cold. "Hold on, just a little longer." But even he couldn't pretend anymore. The Americans were close. Too close. The woods trembled with their presence. Voices drifted between the trees, English words carried on a steady wind. "Push forward. Keep your intervals. Kitchens are moving up behind us, you'll eat soon." That last sentence hit the Germans harder than any artillery barrage. Their enemy was thinking about dinner. Weber turned to his men. Some were crouched. Some were sitting. A few had sunk into the snow, eyes half closed, dangerously close to slipping into the sleep that came before freezing to death. These were good soldiers, loyal, disciplined, courageous. But bravery couldn't warm them. Honor couldn't fill their stomachs. Pride couldn't fight off frostbite. Weber knew what had to happen. "We're not dying out here," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Not like this, not for nothing." Krugwald looked up at him sharply. "Sir." "We're withdrawing from the war," Weber said. It wasn't surrender by protocol. Not yet. But the meaning was unmistakable. "No more fighting," he continued. "No more running, no more starving to prove something that doesn't exist anymore." The men stared at him. Some looked relieved. Others simply nodded, too cold to react. One man quietly wept, not from shame, but because he finally felt safe enough to. Weber raised his hand slowly, not in fear, not in alarm, but in acceptance. "We find the Americans," he said, "and we give ourselves up, alive." Kruger took a breath that fogged heavily in the air. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said softly, "but yes, it's time." Futch whispered, "If they feed us, even once, it'll be more than we've had in a week." No one corrected him. Because it was true. A few minutes later, as the Americans emerged from the tree line, rifles raised but not firing, Weber stepped out first, his hands held high. Snowflakes clung to his sleeves. His breath steamed into the cold. His boots sank halfway into the drift. For a long moment, everything was still. Then an American sergeant shouted, "Hold fire, they're giving up." More soldiers emerged, lowering rifles cautiously. Their faces were wind-burned but alert, fed, rested, ready. A medic rushed forward, scanning the German soldiers and barking an order behind him. "Get those kitchens up here, these men are freezing." The Germans exchanged stunned glances. "Kitchens!" Already on their way. Weber felt something break inside, not pain, not humiliation. Relief. Profound, overwhelming relief. Behind the Americans, just visible through the trees, the familiar silhouettes of the mobile kitchens appeared, steam drifting from their vents like warm breath in the cold. For Weber, Grunwald, Kruger, Futch, and the rest of the platoon, the sight was almost indescribable. Salvation had arrived on wheels. Not with bullets. Not with tanks. But with hot food. The same weapon that had shattered their morale would now save their lives.